The sun dipped low on the horizon as Marcus Hill steered his black SUV off the main road, tires crunching against the dusty gravel driveway that led to his family's long-forgotten ranch. It had been almost 2 decades since he last set foot on this land. 20 acres of open sky, dense oaks, and the aging but sturdy farmhouse his grandfather built with his own hands. In the rearview mirror, the glass towers and gridlock of the city faded away, replaced by the calm, sun-baked quiet of rural life. For Marcus, this wasn't just a property. It was a connection to his roots, to simpler days spent helping his grandfather mend fences and herd cattle, before law school, the bench, and the rigid rituals of federal courtrooms swallowed his world. He approached the front gate. A modern metal barrier marked with a gleaming HOA logo stood tall, something that had never been there before. He frowned slightly, rolled down the window, and tapped the access code given to him by the county clerk. When he finalized the inheritance paperwork, the gate beeped and rolled open slowly. A security camera swiveled toward his vehicle. That was new too. He muttered under his breath, already sensing that time had changed more than he expected. Driving up the long gravel path, Marcus spotted a few scattered homes in the distance, all identical in design, cookie-cutter mansions with manicured lawns and color-matching fences. It was clear now, sometime after his grandfather's passing, the surrounding land had been sold off and folded into a sprawling homeowners association. His ranch, oddly enough, remained intact within its original boundaries, untouched by subdivision. A legal anomaly, but still fully his. He parked under the old carport, stepping out and inhaling the scent of dry grass and cedarwood. He barely had time to stretch his legs before he heard the sound, heels clacking on pavement, fast and full of intent. A woman in her mid-50s stormed up the driveway, holding a clipboard like it was a weapon. Her oversized sunglasses sat like armor on her face, and her blazer looked out of place in the Texas heat. "Excuse me, sir," she barked before he could greet her. "This is private property. You're trespassing." Marcus blinked, thrown off by the hostility. "Actually, this is my land. I just inherited it. My name is Marcus Hill." "I don't care what your name is," she snapped. "This land is under the jurisdiction of the Heritage Oaks Homeowners Association. You can't just show up here without approval. We don't allow strangers to just drive in like this." "I'm not a stranger," Marcus said calmly, reaching into his glove box and pulling out the deed and ID. "This property has been in my family since before this HOA existed. I have the paperwork. I'm not here to cause trouble." Karen didn't even look at the documents. She stepped back, dialing her phone. "I'm calling the sheriff. You're breaking HOA Code 7.3, unauthorized property entry." He raised an eyebrow. "You're calling the cops on a federal judge for accessing his own land?" She paused, narrowing her eyes. "You're a judge? Please." Marcus opened his wallet and held up his badge and judicial ID. Her face twitched, but the phone was already ringing. He could hear her stumbling over her words with dispatch, throwing in phrases like security concern and non-compliant mail. He sighed. This wasn't how his homecoming was supposed to go. Moments later, 2 sheriff's deputies pulled up in a cruiser. Marcus calmly greeted them, showed his documents again, and explained the situation. The officers looked awkward, clearly, recognizing who he was. Karen fumed, arms crossed, as they told her no laws had been broken. She muttered something about taking it to the HOA board. Marcus watched her storm off, already suspecting this wouldn't be the last confrontation. As the officers left and the sun dipped lower, he turned toward the porch and ran his hand along the railing. "Welcome home," he thought. This was going to be war. The flashing red and blue lights painted the ranch's front porch in urgent color as the sheriff's cruiser rolled away, tires crackling against gravel. Marcus remained where he stood, unmoving, arms crossed as the last glimmer of daylight gave way to a velvet sky. Karen, the self-proclaimed HOA queen, stood across from him, on the driveway, fuming, her phone still clutched in her hand as if it were a sword. Her jaw was set in iron, eyes locked onto Marcus like a predator sizing up its prey. "I don't care who you say you are," she finally said, voice lower now but laced with venom. "Nobody gets to just bypass protocol. You're not exempt from HOA regulations because of a title." "I'm not asking for exemption," Marcus replied, calm and collected. "I'm asking for basic respect and acknowledgement of property rights. This land is privately owned. It's not subject to your board's jurisdiction. My title is legally verified, and so is the land deed. Everything you're trying to enforce here doesn't apply to me." Karen shook her head, like he'd said something offensive. "That's not how things work here. If you live in Heritage Oaks, you follow our rules, no exceptions. That includes code compliance, structural reviews, gate access protocols, and neighbor approval for any exterior changes. You'll need to register your vehicle, file your presence with the board, and submit a restoration plan for the ranch, which, if I may say so, looks abandoned." Marcus turned slightly, scanning the land that had been left untouched but held history in every beam and stone. "It's not abandoned. It's waiting," Karen scoffed. "This is a community, not a Wild West museum. You can't just show up with your cowboy boots and act like you're in some Netflix drama." He smiled slightly at the comparison. "Maybe not, but I know the law, and this property was excluded from the HOA boundaries when it was formed. Read the documents. You're operating on assumptions, not legal authority." Karen's nostrils flared. "You want a fight? You'll get one." She turned on her heel and marched down the driveway, nearly tripping over a garden light, but recovering quickly. "I'm calling an emergency board meeting. Don't be surprised when you're fined for every day you've been on this property without proper clearance." Marcus watched her go, noting every word. The arrogance, the entitlement, the blind certainty that her rule book trumped everything else. He had seen people like her in the courtroom, authoritarians in suburbia, using bureaucracy as a weapon. She wasn't just trying to protect a neighborhood, she was trying to control it. And she had clearly ruled unchallenged for a long time, Night fell. Marcus moved inside the old ranch house. The air was thick with dust, and the scent of old wood filled his lungs. With a single flashlight beam, he illuminated the dusty photographs on the wall. His grandfather, in a wide-brimmed hat, leaning against the very same fence Karen now tried to claim. These weren't just memories. They were stakes. Proof of legacy. The next morning came fast. Marcus had barely sipped his coffee when he heard voices, multiple this time. Outside, several HOA board members stood at the gate, clipboards and tablets in hand. Karen stood at the center like a conductor of chaos, her lips pursed in triumph. "We've reviewed the records," she announced as he stepped outside. "We believe your deed is invalid and possibly forged. We'll be escalating this to legal counsel and restricting all access until the matter is clarified." Marcus didn't even flinch. He reached into his satchel, pulled out a thick folder, and handed it to her. "This is the original exemption agreement from the county and the court order that returned this land to my name. Signed, sealed, and federally backed. I suggest you read every line carefully before threatening me again." Karen didn't take it. Instead, she folded her arms and sneered. "We'll see what the board decides." Marcus stared at her for a long moment. "No, Ms. Whitlock, you'll see what the law decides." As the crowd dispersed, whispering and glancing back, Marcus knew this wasn't just a petty dispute. It was a battle for power, and Karen had just picked the wrong man to test. The following days passed in a strange mix of silence and surveillance. Marcus could feel eyes on him every time he stepped outside, whether it was Karen parked discreetly at the corner or her army of HOA loyalists walking their identical poodles. Past his ranch 3 times a day, there was no mistaking the sudden uptick in neighborhood activity. The once tranquil return to his roots had quickly morphed into a turf war. One fought not with weapons, but with paperwork, passive-aggressive notes, and threats buried in bureaucratic language. He started noticing the little things first. Violation notice appeared taped to his gate one morning, citing improper fencing height, though his fence had stood that way for decades. The next day, a bright orange sticker marked unregistered vehicle was slapped onto his truck, which was parked squarely on his own land. A formal letter followed, accusing him of maintaining a non-compliant structure that disrupted the neighborhood's aesthetic, meaning apparently the old farmhouse wasn't beige enough. Marcus didn't react. Instead, he observed. He collected every note, recorded every interaction, and began pulling records from the county office. It didn't take long for the pattern to emerge. Karen's HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, they were selectively weaponizing them. Residents who pushed back on her policies often found themselves targeted by sudden code violations or surprise fees. One neighbor had been fined thousands for unauthorized shrub placement. Another had their mailbox removed after refusing to repaint it in HOA-approved colors. And in each case, the common thread was silence. No one dared challenge her. Then came the visit from a soft-spoken older man named Thomas who lived 3 houses down. He knocked hesitantly on Marcus's door, nervously glancing over his shoulder, as if he were committing a crime just by standing there. When Marcus invited him in, Thomas lowered his voice. "I heard you were a judge," he said. "I thought maybe you'd listen." He went on to describe how Karen had fined him nearly $12,000 over 3 years for phantom violations, everything from fence maintenance to excessive noise, though he lived alone and barely left the house. When he contested the charges, Karen threatened to place a lien on his home. "I've thought about selling, just to get away," Thomas said. "But I'm 68. This is my home. I can't afford to start over." That night, Marcus opened his laptop and began digging deeper. Through public records, he unearthed a troubling trail. Karen had held the HOA presidency for 7 straight years, despite bylaws limiting leadership terms to 2. Board elections were mysteriously undocumented. Financial reports were vague, or missing altogether. Most damning, though, was the HOA's legal registration. Somewhere along the line, their official status had quietly lapsed, but they continued to operate, collect dues, and issue fines as if nothing had changed. Marcus wasn't just looking at an overzealous neighbor. This was systemic abuse, a mini dictatorship hiding behind flower beds and architectural guidelines. By the end of the week, 2 more residents approached him. A young couple had been threatened with eviction for installing solar panels. Another man claimed Karen had harassed his teenage daughter for wearing inappropriate attire on her own lawn. Each story added a layer to the growing mountain of misconduct. And with every testimony, Marcus's resolve deepened. He was no longer simply defending his inheritance. He was uncovering a coordinated effort to bully, intimidate, and control an entire neighborhood, one that had gone unchecked for far too long. He gathered the evidence, compiled affidavits, and prepared the legal complaint. Not as a homeowner, but as a federal judge with a duty to protect the rights of citizens, even in places where the weapon of choice was an HOA violation notice. Karen had picked a battle she thought she could win. What she didn't know was that her opponent wasn't just another neighbor, he was the law. The courtroom was packed, an unusual sight for a civil case involving a suburban homeowners association. Word had spread quickly, perhaps too quickly, that a federal judge had filed a case not only against a local HOA but against its president personally, citing fraud, abuse of power, and civil rights violations. Media vans lined the street outside the courthouse. Inside, murmurs filled the air, broken only by the gavel's stern thud as the session was brought to order. Marcus sat at the plaintiff's table, composed and silent. He wasn't here as the judge today. He was the plaintiff, represented by a sharp and experienced civil rights attorney who understood the gravity of the case. Across the room sat Karen Whitlock, flanked by 2 attorneys, both looking visibly uneasy despite their confident suits. Karen, on the other hand, wore her usual smirk, as if convinced the courtroom was just another HOA meeting she could dominate with intimidation and technicalities. The judge, a colleague of Marcus from another district, wasted no time. "Let's get to the heart of this," she said, her voice slicing through the tension. "We're not dealing with a simple zoning dispute. This case involves accusations of systemic abuse, fraudulent governance, and illegal enforcement of HOA regulations without legal standing. Mr. Hill, your counsel may proceed." Witness after witness was called. First came Thomas, his hands trembling slightly as he described the fabricated fines and the sleepless nights worrying about losing his home. Then came the young couple who had been fined for their solar panels. Sustainable. Improvements that should have been praised, but were instead punished because Karen didn't like how they looked. A teenage girl testified next, her voice cracking as she recounted how Karen confronted her with a clipboard in hand, shouting about decency and threatening to fine her parents. Each account painted a clearer picture of what the HOA had become, a weaponized extension of one woman's ego. Financial records were introduced, revealing inconsistencies and large unexplained expenditures. Elections had never been held. Karen had simply renewed her presidency year after year by altering bylaws without a majority vote. It wasn't governance. It was tyranny wrapped in shrubbery and driveway regulations. Karen's attorneys attempted to deflect. They claimed the HOA had the right to enforce standards. They tried to cast the homeowners as rebellious troublemakers. But the evidence was overwhelming. Emails surfaced, showing Karen threatening residents with legal action if they spoke out. A whistleblower from the board testified that Karen forged meeting minutes and discouraged dissent by manipulating fines. Then came the smoking gun. Marcus's legal team presented the HOA's expired state registration. It had lapsed 2 years prior. Legally, the HOA hadn't existed at all during much of Karen's rule, meaning every fine, every threat, every dollar collected was not only unethical, but unlawful. Karen stood to speak, unable to resist defending herself. She accused Marcus of overstepping, of using his position to punish a woman trying to maintain order. Her tone was self-righteous, even as the judge stared down at her with cool disapproval. When closing statements concluded, the judge took only minutes to deliver her verdict. This court finds the defendant guilty of fraud, harassment, and unlawful governance. The HOA is hereby dissolved. Ms. Whitlock is to be fined and barred from participating in any community leadership or homeowner association for a period of no less than 10 years. Damages will be awarded to the plaintiffs. A wave of relief passed through the courtroom. Karen's expression faltered for the first time, shock replacing smugness. Marcus stood slowly, buttoned his jacket, and glanced at the rows of neighbors behind him. Many were teary-eyed, others stunned, but all of them were free at last. He hadn't just won a case, he had dismantled a regime. In the weeks that followed the courtroom victory, the atmosphere in Heritage Oaks transformed. Gone were the quiet, fearful glances exchanged across driveways and under porch lights. Gone were the notices taped to doors and the endless letters filled with threats masked as reminders. For the first time in years, the residents felt what true community could be, free from surveillance, fines, and the ever-looming presence of Karen's authority. Marcus remained on his ranch, spending his mornings walking the perimeter fence, and his afternoons clearing out old storage sheds and breathing life back into the home his grandfather once cherished. He wasn't just restoring a structure, he was restoring dignity to the land and to himself. Where once the ranch was a forgotten relic surrounded by suburban conformity, now it stood as a symbol of perseverance, of one man's refusal to be bullied into silence. The former HOA board, now disbanded, had all but disappeared from public view. Some members issued public apologies. Others moved away quietly, unwilling to face the community without the shield of Karen's dominance. Karen herself had gone into hiding after her sentencing. Local news stations replayed footage of the verdict, and social media buzzed with clips of her defiant courtroom speech, contrasted against the judge's swift rebuke. Her name had become synonymous with HOA corruption, a cautionary tale whispered in cul-de-sacs across the state. But Marcus hadn't sought fame. He had only wanted peace. One morning, while repairing a section of the back fence, he noticed a line of cars pulling into the ranch's gravel driveway. For a moment, a flicker of tension crossed his face. Old habits from the conflict still lingered. But as the doors opened, familiar faces emerged. Thomas, the elderly neighbor, was there with a tray of homemade biscuits. The young couple arrived. With fresh paint buckets and brushes, the teenager brought a foldable chair and a radio. One by one, more residents showed up, each carrying something small. A tool, a snack, a story. "We figured," Thomas said, adjusting his cap, "that since you helped clean up our neighborhood, the least we could do was help you clean up this ranch." Marcus looked at the gathering crowd, a genuine smile breaking across his usually reserved face. "You didn't have to—" "No," the young woman interrupted. "You didn't have to, but you did. You stood up for us when we were scared to speak, so now it's our turn." Together, they spent the day repainting the fence, repairing the porch steps, and cutting down overgrown brush. Laughter rang through the air. Kids played tag between toolboxes. Someone set up a grill, and the smell of burgers and corn filled the open yard. What had once been a battleground had become a celebration. As dusk settled over the land, Marcus stood on the porch, looking out over the sea of people he had once known only as silent neighbors. Now, they were allies, friends. The air carried a new sense of unity, forged not in conformity, but in courage. Later that night, Marcus sat at the old wooden desk inside the ranch house, staring at the framed black and white photo of his grandfather. He lit the lamp, opened a notebook, and began to write. Not court orders, not legal arguments, but a story. The story of a fight that started with a gate and ended with a community reclaiming its voice. He closed the book and looked outside. The stars were clearer now, no longer obscured by tension or fear. Peace had returned to Heritage Oaks, not because someone enforced it, but because someone had dared to challenge what was wrong. For Marcus, it wasn't just about winning a case. It was about protecting something deeper. The idea that even in the smallest corners of America, justice still mattered.